Hello everyone, this is the lucky 7th episode of Princeton Startup TV. Lucky not just because it's 7th, but because we're honored to have Brian Kernighan on this program. Brian doesn't need any introduction, but just for full protocol, I'll just mention some of the pieces from his biography. Brian Kernighan was the co-author of a C programming language book, the computing classic, which taught millions of programmers C. He's the co-author of programming languages called AWK and AMPL, professor of computer science at Princeton, contributed to the development of Unix alongside Unix creators Ken Thomson, Dennis Ritchie, coined the term Unix, in fact. He developed well-known heuristics for graph partitioning, traveling salesman person, offered many Unix programs. The list goes on, and but it's a pleasure to have Professor Kernighan on the program. Hi.
My pleasure to be here, absolutely.
Very glad that we are in the office, and let's start off with things like, where did you grow up?
I was born in Canada, actually. I was born in Toronto and grew up in Toronto. I was an undergraduate at the University of Toronto. Mm-hmm. And came to Princeton as a grad student in 1964. Mm-hmm. Spent 5 years here almost, and then went and worked at Bell Labs and been in and around this area ever since.
Right. And then you decided to teach at Princeton around 2000.
Yes.
What was it? How did it come about? How did it come about, the decision?
I'd done sort of adjunct teaching where I would teach one course at some place for one semester, and in fact I had done that at Princeton once in the early 1990s, enjoyed that, and then I spent one semester at Harvard in 1995, I think it was, where I taught a very, very large course, sort of an introductory computer science course to over 400 students. Mm-hmm. And that taught me that I could at least handle any of the mechanical aspects of running a big course, all of the problems you run into with huge courses. And so a few years later, when Princeton made me an offer, I came, and it's been great fun ever since.
Yeah, you have a great course called Course 333, Advanced Programming Techniques, and this course is known for its final projects. What were the interesting projects which came out of the course, the most memorable ones, at least?
I think there have been so many that it's hard to keep track of them all, unfortunately. At this year, there were over 120 students in the class, so I have 31 projects, which is, of course, many too many, and they're very early this year. I think some of the most successful ones, two of them come particularly to mind. One is a system that is called the Integrated Course Engine, and it's used by essentially every undergraduate on campus to try and create a schedule of classes for the upcoming semester. It's a very interactive Ajax-based website that lets you search for things like courses that are in a particular department or satisfy some kind of requirement or that fit a particular part of your schedule. And it just populates a web page. Very conveniently, if you have courses that conflict with each other, it shows them side by side. You can pick one of them, then the other one goes away. It's extremely flexible. And this was done by a group of 5 sophomores in the class 4 or 5 years ago, and then refined by a student as his senior project a couple of years ago. And it is in continuous ongoing use. It's been supported by the local student government. And as I say, I honestly think there is no student on the campus who has not used it. So that's a clear-cut winner.
Absolutely.
The other one that comes to mind, I think, is a project that was probably one of the very first iPhone applications. It was done by Adam Ernst and several other folks in 2008 when the iPhone development environment had just appeared on the scene. And they built a system that made it possible to do basically transit information, public transit information in big cities like New York or San Francisco. And it would provide information on subway schedules, bus schedules, ways to get to the airport or locations downtown. And it did it all in a very, very convenient and graphically elegant way on an iPhone. And after they did the project, which was a great project, Adam went off and continued to work on that project, and he is in fact at this point supporting it. It's his full-time job, and so he's doing very well with it, and it has expanded it to many more systems. So I think those two would stand out as just absolutely splendid, but almost all of them are really interesting and kind of intriguing.
Is it the iPhone app which doesn't require internet connection, right, to kind of see the schedule system?
That's correct. It does not require internet access.
Kind of it.
So you can use it in places like the New York subway where there is no internet access at the moment. And so it's a good system. It's a great system.
Very useful. And I mean, some of the projects which at least I heard of was the one developed in 2004. Like a couple months later, after Facebook, but a group of students came with this independently. It was a social network built for Princeton students, and they show like the top, I think, most social students on the first page, with all this who built the biggest number of connections, and so it's really amazing how a course can really inspire people to build great things.
I think it has nothing to do with me. You put the students in an environment where they have to do something and tell them they can do whatever they want, and then they go off and do amazing things. It really is good. And the one you mentioned, it was called ULink, if I remember correctly. It was done by Michael Lee, who was at the time, again, a sophomore here, and he was very close to doing social networks at the same time that they were popular. And if he were a different kind of person, perhaps he could have become Mark Zuckerberg. Who knows? It was
very
great.
Cool. You worked on many different areas: graph algorithms, software engineering, software tools, and programming languages. What are your current research interests?
I think most of my interests at the moment, partly I'm interested in just how do you write programs more effectively, and so I spend a lot of time just playing with languages and tools, particularly for web-based development, and I think that's partly because it also fits into the course. I tend to spend summers at Google, and so I work on projects there, sometimes which have that property. Sometimes they're no more than simple exploratory data analysis. That tends to mostly happen in the summer, and in the academic year, I mostly tend to get wrapped up in teaching. It becomes a full-time job for that. The other thing, you can't call it research, I think, but I spend a lot of time trying to talk about non-technical material for technical material for very non-technical people. And so I spent a sabbatical year, 2010, 2011, academic year at Harvard, writing a book for the course I teach in the fall for non-technical students, a book called D is for Digital.
Yeah, I luckily have a copy.
Armand, thank you. And so that's a very different flavor of activity, but it's been great fun because the course that I teach related to it is so much fun to teach.
Yeah, and there's a course offered, Computer Science
109.
109, right? Computers in Our World, which was, I guess, kind of inspired you to write this book.
Yes. The course is definitely the inspiration for it. I've been teaching that course since I got here every fall, basically. And the audience for that class is people who are not technical. Their interests tend to be in things like history or English or economics. But I think it's important that they should know something about how technology works because it affects their lives enormously. The fact that we can do something like this video and post it on the web is something that was not possible 10 years ago even. And it very much changes the way that one thinks about the world. Mm-hmm. And so what I would like is the students in that class who are not technical but are certainly still going to be in positions of influence or authority or whatever, that they should actually understand something about the technology that we're all living with all the time. And the more they know, the better. So that's the justification for both the course and for writing the book.
Absolutely. I mean, it's appeared in Hacker News recently. It's great to read for non-technical readers, and I mean, just clearly shows that Professor Kernighan is really passionate about kind of democratizing the computer science. It's and kind of maybe dispel this gospel that computers is only for this cohort of people and only 1% of population can understand it. In fact, we interact with it on a regular basis, and I guess.
Yes, right. It's a pervasive part of our lives, and in fact, that degree at which it's a total integral part of our lives, I think, is, if anything, accelerating. And so
yeah.
I think if you don't know something about how computing and related technologies work, you're at a major disadvantage.
Very cool. I mean, we'll come back to the kind of D for digital later, but let's quickly discuss programming languages. You co-developed AMPL and AWK, a mathematical programming language and a scripting language called AWK. What were the goals of these two languages?
The goals of AWK were basically to make it really easy to write very simple programs, the kind of program where in your heart you know it ought to be just a line or two of code. If the language supported it, you could express what you wanted to do in just a few lines of code. There was an example a few days ago that I was talking to a student here. He was going through a list of basically volcanic eruptions, and the job was, the data was a date, the name, like Krakatoa, and the magnitude of the eruption, and his job was to find all of the volcanic eruptions which had magnitude greater than 6 or something like that. And that's a perfectly fine example of the sort of thing that AWK was meant to solve, because that's a one-line program. In fact, it's a 4-character program. So you just say the third field is greater than 6, and you're done. So AWK was meant for that kind of very simple-minded data selection and rearrangement, transformation, summarization, the kind of thing that might have been done by report generation. So it's been around for a long time. We first started working on that in 1977, and it continues to be widely used. I support one version of it, although not the most widely used version of it. And it's considered a core Unix tool. And I think in terms of scripting languages, it probably provides the most bang for the buck. It does not scale to it definitely does not scale to big programs, but for programs that are really only a few lines long, it's hard to beat.
Very cool.
Oh, and AMPL.
Yeah.
AMPL is a totally different thing. It was done. AWK, I should say, was done with Aho and Peter Weinberger. We were all at Bell Labs at the time. In fact, in 3 adjacent offices. AMPL was done with Bob Forer and David Gay, who were both at Bell Labs at the time. And Bob was a professor of management science, very interested in optimization problems, and so was Dave. And I was interested in the language design issues. So AMPL is a language for specifying optimization problems like linear programming, quadratic programming, integer programming, all of the different kinds of problem that have the word programming as part of their name. In spite of that, it's not strictly a programming language in that sense. It's a declarative language, but it is a very, very convenient way for describing the sets and the parameters and the variables and the constraints that make up an optimization problem. And then with that specification plus data that describes a particular problem instance, you can feed that into any of dozens of solvers like CPlex or OSL or Minos, and those do the optimization and give you back numbers. So it's in effect a high-level language for describing optimization problems where different solvers are the computing engines.
Wow, very interesting. What do you think of the modern kind of web, so-called web programming languages like Ruby and Python?
I think, yeah, let's call them scripting languages, roughly speaking. Yeah, there's a bunch of scripting languages that I think all have something to offer. Perl is perhaps the earliest of this group, and Perl was a wonderful language for doing system administration tasks, which is kind of where it started, and then it got a second life when the web came along. Python is another language. Python is probably the one that I use most at this point. It's the one that I'm teaching in the course most often this spring. I have never really used Ruby other than for the most trivial applications, but I would think that it's just exactly as useful and, excuse me, in the same general class. Very, very useful language for writing many kinds of programs. Basically, scripting languages like Perl and Python and Ruby, and I would include PHP, and the list could go on. They're very useful for tasks that require manipulating text primarily. They provide notational conveniences like regular expressions, which make it very, very easy to specify patterns of text for finding them, searching them, or manipulating. They usually provide some basic data structure like an associative array or a hash table or a dictionary, which is very convenient. That's all that AWK provides. And they tend to be typeless, or essentially typeless, and so you don't have to say very much. The types and operations and so on variables are just inferred by the context in which they're found. And so all of those means that these languages are very effective for writing small programs, short, simple programs to do manipulations that may be standalone themselves, or they may be glue that holds together other larger computations.
Right.
I think they scale up to some extent, but not hugely. I would be deeply suspicious of a Perl or Python program that was more than 5 or 10 pages long, let's say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but the frameworks like Django and Flask and they kind of, I think pcherry, I think this minimalist Python framework, we're getting some traction people are using.
Right. Yeah, and in fact, frameworks like those, in particular Django, which is the one I'm most familiar with, are, I think, very, very convenient because they're using a nice language, and then the task that they're doing is so stereotyped, so organized, because it's built a web client and server, that they can generate a lot of code for you and provide a nice organizing mechanism or structure for the program that's going to be written.
Right.
So, and for that, I think because they're so well organized, the size can be noticeably bigger. But I don't think that, let's say, Google is going to run their infrastructure as a Python program.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Twitter was built on Ruby on Rails initially, and then they had to rewrite the entire thing in Scala.
Right.
As they were solving this beautiful problem, really nice problem to have, scalability.
Yes, right.
Right. I mean, you mentioned that you spend your summers at Google, and it just occurred to me that, well, Google has Gideon Possum, the creator of Python, James Gosling, the creator of Java, and Brian Kernighan, the creator of AWK, the co-creator of AWK and AMPL. Do you guys hold, I don't know, do you hang out together?
Well, your list is not quite right. Guido van Rossum is still at Google, definitely, and although I've talked to him, I've never actually met him in person, unfortunately. James Gosling is no longer at Google. He was for a while, but has left.
Oh, really?
Peter Weinberger, who is the W of AWK, is in fact at Google in New York, and I see him very frequently. So in that sense, we keep it in touch, but not beyond that.
Very interesting. What Unix operating system are you running on your computer?
Whatever comes along. The local environment here in the computer science department is Red Hat, Linux. I don't know what it is. I think at Google they tend to use a flavor of Ubuntu. It doesn't matter in a very strong sense.
Right. So regarding the books you read recently, and which you would mention, worth recommending and so on. Some of the books you read recently.
Books that I've read recently.
Yeah.
It's a good question. I tend to read, only two kinds of books for, let's call it for pleasure, as opposed for books that I have to read. The nonfiction side tends to be history in various forms and guises. For example, I'm reading a big book on the history of the Second World War now, one of many that I have read recently. And on the other side, it tends to be absolute pure escapism, that I read basically detective stories, police procedurals, and things like that, preferably set in England, but not necessarily. So,
what are your all-time favorites?
I don't know. The authors that I have liked have mostly been the English detective story ones. Reginald Hill was a favorite. I enjoyed P.D. James for a long time. I could probably find others, but that's the sort of book that I have. And you could argue that it's a total waste of time, but it's fun. Very often the problem with nonfiction books is that it's hard to get through them in a reasonable amount of time, because I tend to read them in the evening before going to bed, and if you read for too long, you fall asleep anyway. And so that has meant that I haven't gotten through any number of books that I really would like to. Books on, I read one on Henry VIII recently, another one on Elizabeth I,
right.
Following along like that. I didn't get through one on T.E. Lawrence, which I just couldn't finish before the library wanted it back. So maybe if I ever retire, there'll be more time to read books.
What books do you read, if any? what blogs?
I don't read any blogs, roughly
Yeah.
speaking. I look at occasional sites because of specialized interests. Grokla is probably the most obvious one, but for the most part, I don't read blogs.
Okay, so things like social news, like hacker news, and it's not really.
No.
Okay. In terms of things you do for fun, I mean, you mentioned that you studied Japanese for a while, so it's like we have programming languages on one side and natural languages on the other side. What other things do you do for fun?
Oh, for the most part, I don't do very much at this point. I used to play quite badly racket sports, particularly squash and racquetball, but gotten past the stage that I do that anymore. I used to ski, but very badly, and I don't do that anymore. And so I think my sort of athletic kinds of things at this point consist of basically going for long walks. And so I try to keep in shape by walking 3, 4, or 5 miles a day if I can manage it. And that's fundamentally it. I enjoy music a lot. I used to play the piano, but badly, and I don't anymore, but I still listen to an awful lot of music, mostly classical music. One of the things I do in my classes is that I play music at the beginning of the class, from the time I get into the room until it's time to start teaching. And the music that I play there is very eclectic, strange, but it mostly has classical bass, although it's sometimes improvisations or jazz versions of classics and things like that. And I post the playlists on my websites for the course so people can see my bizarre tastes.
Do you use any music discovery sites like Pandora? Or,
no. I tried Pandora for a while, and it was kind of fun, but then I ran through the list of things they had that were things that I liked. And I think part of it may be that my tastes run to classical and relatively older, and their library and repertoire caters obviously to much newer music aimed at younger people. And so I ran out quite quickly of what they had to offer.
I really like to ask this question, but kind of through the course of the different interviews, I kind of refined it, and now I would probably ask it in the following form: How does your day look like? Let's say in the summer, when you are free from academia and.
Yeah, in the summer, well, my day when I'm going to Google is that I commute to New York, so it means I get up at 5 in the morning and catch the train shortly before 6, and then I spend the day at Google, and then I come home in the afternoon, late afternoon, and by then I'm tired, so I will spend the evening either reading random things or listening to music or both, and then repeat it the next day. But that doesn't say anything about the weekend.
What about the weekend?
Then you do all the things you didn't have time to do during the week.
I see. Do you have do you follow this advice? Start your day as a producer rather than consumer, because what tends to happen nowadays with like new generation, including all the students here, is that we tend to get caught up in email and social networking sites like Twitter and Facebook and hacker news. That's the first thing we do in the morning, unfortunately.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yes. I don't do as much perhaps as you do. It's simplified by the fact that I don't use Facebook and I don't use Twitter and I don't use any other social networking site. So I don't have to worry about that aspect. I do tend to start by looking at email that has accumulated over the night. And sometimes that during the school year I have to do that because there's students to deal with in one way or another. And I often look at a handful of websites that I follow. Grokla I mentioned. I look at Slashdot sometimes. And then typically I read the paper, and I read the paper on paper. So that already says that I'm in a different world than lots of people.
Well, but for some reason, so I saw some of the quotes people picked from the interviews with you, and I think that your style and will be really good for Twitter. I don't encourage you to. I don't want to destroy productivity or something. But what do you think of this short, concise 140 character messages, which can be broadcasted to everyone and kind of let you get in touch with big community of people?
I guess I shouldn't knock it if I haven't tried it, but it just isn't me. I think that a message that you want a lot of people to hear probably has some natural length. And for some messages, that might indeed be 140 characters or less. And I think for other things, it's probably substantially more. I don't think that you can write a book 140 characters at a time, for instance. So,
but for quotes?
For quotes, yeah, sure. I could imagine, but I don't think I'll ever do it.
Interesting. For example, one of best-selling authors, Nassim Taleb, the author of Black Swan, he used to have a Twitter account, for she's not anymore, where he would just put some aphorisms, and then he would think he put it down when he decided to publish a book, which was a collection of all these aphorisms he published on Twitter. Okay, I will not convince you to try Twitter. Recently, Tim Ferriss published an interview with popular fiction author Paulo Coelho, the Brazilian author, and he asked him, how do you write? And what is the process like as an author of 9 books now, right, including the D for Digital, These for Digital? What is the process like? How do you spend the months when you're writing?
I think what I do is that I think about it for quite a while, and I sketch outlines of some, often not very much detail, an outline that might fit on a single page. And then at some point I say it's time to start writing, and I just write. And I try to write fairly quickly, so that the Dias for Digital book, for example, I wrote the entire first draft in no more than 2 months, I think. Trying to crank out 2,000 or 3,000 words a day sometimes, if possible. And if you write quickly like that, then that means the quality is low. So then go through and revise and revise and revise continuously. Just keep revising until it feels smooth and coherent and organized. And sometimes that means big rearrangements where whole things will move around, and a lot of it is more sentence, paragraph level and detailed wording. So that's my mechanism. I know some authors say that they can write it right the first time. As Isaac Asimov, who wrote 500 books, used to say that he just wrote the stuff straight down. Just, he'd write the book, it was done, and he wouldn't revise or anything, move on to the next one. I admire somebody who can do that, but that's certainly not my style. So
your style is to let your right brain kind of put it in a flow and then revise it afterwards.
Yes. Lots and lots and lots of revision. Yeah.
What are the challenges of writing a book nowadays? I mean, this book is self-published, and so I guess you designed the cover.
Yes, I am not a graphic designer, as you can tell.
Well, and I guess as a personal experience in typesetting, you typesetted the book itself as well.
Yeah,
right?
I did the typesetting myself because I have typeset all of my books mostly with co-authors at Bell Labs, because that was at the time something that I was also doing research in. So we were doing research in tools for document preparation, and the books were often a good way to show that the tools actually worked well.
Ditroff EQN, right?
Yes, right. Things for typesetting mathematics, tables, which was Mike Lesk's work, and picture drawing, which I used in this book as well. Lots of things like that, and the basic formatting tools. So in a sense, doing this book was going back to things that I had done quite a while ago. The style of the physical style and layout and so on is actually fairly similar to the AMPL book, which I was fairly happy with the layout on that one. The challenges, it's funny, I wasn't sure for quite a while what I was going to actually do it with, what I was going to produce it with. I started thinking perhaps I'll just do HTML, because HTML sort of formats itself nicely automatically. You don't have to think about it. But that quickly became unworkable. It was too hard to do a lot of the things I wanted to do. So I switched to Word for a while, and Word was very effective for getting a lot of words in quickly. Because I could type very quickly, I could always have a clean looking copy of it. But Word is not suitable for writing books, really. It's too hard to make systematic changes. In many cases, it was uncontrollable. I would make a change at the beginning, and the whole book would reformat in some bizarre way. And so one day I decided I'm going to go back to the devil I know. I guess I had a LaTeX phase in there somewhere too, but I had never really internalized LaTeX. That would have been an option, I think, but I also find it uncontrollable. So finally I went back to the devil I know, and I used ditroff.
Yeah.
And all of these things are imperfect in various ways, but ditroff is the one where I know the imperfections and know how to get around them. So and I used the groff, the open source version of ditroff at this point, which was actually very good, and all of the open source equivalents, tools that go along with it, like PIC and EQN and the like. So it's very helpful that the open source community contributed so much to that.
So it's great that you're using the tools.
I started some of them, and they've come around, and others have maintained them, which is just wonderful.
What about the challenges in publishing?
The challenges in publishing, it's interesting. All of my previous books have been published by conventional publishers, primarily at this point Addison Wesley and Prentice Hall, which are under the same corporate empire, and that has been very good. Those are great publishers, and I have some really, really good friends who are editors there. But I think that this particular book was not in a market that they're particularly interested in, and so my editors, in fact, were very supportive and said, if you want to do self-publishing, go for it. And so I did it. I tried Lulu briefly, and that was helpful for getting quick drafts, but in the end, I tried Amazon's CreateSpace, where I think the financial arrangements are actually better for authors, and Amazon, for better or worse, is a very, very large operation, and if I can say to somebody, well, go to Amazon and get the book, and everybody knows what that means. So
and it's available in Kindle version as well.
It is also available on the Kindle. I did the paper version first because I know what I'm doing there, at least approximately. The process is very simple. You upload a PDF, and 12 hours later, it's available on Amazon, so it's hard to beat. The Kindle version, I then spent another probably 3-4 weeks reversing this process.
What is it like?
I had to produce a Kindle version. Basically, you're producing HTML. So I started in HTML, went through all of these things that failed to ditroff, and then to go to the Kindle version, I had to go back to the HTML. So I wrote Python scripts that converted my ditroff back into HTML, which is sort of embarrassing. But again, the process is very straightforward once you have it working, and Amazon's emulators for various ebook formats are quite good. Once I was satisfied with that, it seemed fine. I actually bought a low-end Kindle to just see it on a real device, and I had friends who tried it on other things like iPads. And once it seemed all right, the same operation. You upload a file, and 12 hours later, it's available. So very, very simple. And I think that ability to create your own words in whatever form and size and so on you want, set your own price for it, and then just have somebody publish it is going to greatly change the way that publishing is done for many people over the future. Will it change everything? Probably not, but I think it's a big effect. The other thing is that book is dirt cheap by comparison. I'm sure if I'd gone through a conventional publisher, it would be 3 times the price it is at this
because
point.
of all the intermediaries.
Yes, exactly.
What about, so this is Princeton Startup TV, so I guess we'll just include a really quick startup question here. There is a kind of old question, join or start, and so there's a community of people, including myself, who always been picky about companies we choose to work at, and maybe sometimes some hedonistic in their approaches and thinking I will never do something which I don't enjoy. At the same time, having that approach, you end up passing on opportunities which can, in the long run, lead to greater learning and just extending your horizons and so on. What is your take on this? Do you, as a graduate person, let's say, as people who just are graduating this year, the seniors, and maybe graduate students who are graduating and thinking of where to apply their knowledge, what is your take on this? Should you join or should you start? I mean, given the fact that you are willing to do both.
Yeah, I don't think there's a single good answer to that. I think what I have typically said to students here who ask a question along those lines is that when you are relatively young and if you are relatively unattached, you don't have, let's say, a spouse, kids, whatever, that's a good time to try things that have a significant downside risk. Startup is an example of that. A startup might succeed beyond your wildest dreams, or it might fail totally, leaving you unemployed. But I think it's a good time in your sort of personal life. You can do that in your 20s. It would be harder to do that in your 40s unless you had some other kind of safety net behind you. But after that, I think it's personal taste, and different people have different tastes. There are more options today, I think, certainly than when I went out. When I graduated, there were no options. Roughly, you could go to work for a biggish company. There were relatively few smallish companies in the field, I guess, or you could go on in academia if you wanted, and that was about it. It would be very unusual to start your own company. Today, the barriers to entry in computing-related fields are so low that it's easy to start a company. All it takes is one good idea and perhaps one or two like-minded people, and off you go. And because you can get very easily all of the resources you need, computing power, languages, tools, the environments, it's all available. So that means that there are more options. Doesn't make the decision any easier. Perhaps it makes it harder because there are more options.
Decision paralysis, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so if I were, let's say, your age or an undergrad a few years younger at this point, I would say think hard about it and then do what turns you on. Do something that really is interesting. Doesn't matter what it is. If it turns you on, it's got to be a good deal.
And final word to students and to those who haven't yet figured out what to do with their lives, from Brian Kernighan.
I think I just said it. I think you should do something that you really, really like to do. If you're doing something that you enjoy, you'll have a heck of a lot better life than if you're doing something you don't like.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Brian.
My pleasure.
It was a great episode. See you.